We are back again for another episode of the Bare Necessities, but today it's a collaboration day. So we're doing a Bare Necessities 2030 Leadership Newsletter collaboration. We're bringing back my friend and one of the coolest, innovative thinkers that I know, Matt Hooper. Matt, how we doing, my friend?
We're doing well, Rob. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the collaboration. Yeah, I'm excited to put this out in the pod and in our LinkedIn newsletter. Um, Dear listener, dear viewer, what we were discussing just before we got on here was that Rob and I both woke up excited. I think we're kindly telling each other we were excited for this conversation, but we're not really sure if we were just excited that it was Friday or if we were going to be talking to each other. That was the big conversation that was happening off camera, off mic.
I mean, for me, it's always like I love Fridays just in general, but especially Fridays when we're gonna sit down and record some pod episodes and talk about really cool shit. Like to me, like that gets me excited, and that was the reason. Like, usually when you wake up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, it's because you're in a panic because you're like nervous and anxiety
Right.
ridden.
It's an
Like,
anxiety wake up.
yeah,
It's not like a
no,
let's go get them wake
which
up.
is
Yeah.
what surprised me because at 35, I woke up like a 7 year old at Christmas time for today, and I know that that's not how I wake up every Friday. So I'm guessing it's a combination of the two. But yeah, we're excited, and we've been wanting to get this collaboration going for a while, and I think the best thing to do is just take a minute and explain what the 2030 newsletter leadership newsletter is about, and what your impact that you wanted to create by launching it.
Sure. So I spend my time as the managing director of Idea US, which is the American-based arm of the Danish management consulting firm. And Idea was founded on principles and ideas in a book called Dreams and Details, written by Jim Snebe and Mikkel Trolle, who are our chairman and CEO, respectively. And Dreams and Details literally puts forward a leadership methodology, a leadership sort of framework blueprint um, for, and this is what I fell in love with it for, beyond that it's practical. We'll get into that in a minute, for a number of different kinds of leaders, right? But very specifically, I think the thing that differentiates so much of the work I've been able to do as a practitioner of Dreams and Details, and so much of the work that Idea has done as a firm, especially up till now in Denmark, is helping leaders reinvent their institutions from a position of strength. So it's for folks in, not exclusively, but really began life as something that helped senior leaders and senior executives of some of the world's largest businesses and institutions reinvent their entire firm and take real chances that they otherwise might not have in order to realize an ambitious dream. And then, of course, what are the crucial details necessary to realize that dream, right? That's why the methodology is called Dreams and Details. And again, I mentioned that I found this to be very practical, but there's a lot of which is rare in a new sort of leadership methodology. I was employing it in my own life before I worked at the firm and helped build the firm here in the U.S. But and I have a corporate innovation background to an extent, which we'll talk about in a minute. And I know that's a big part of what we want to talk about today. But the reason, there's a roundabout way of saying the reason why I did the newsletter was there are a lot of different sorts of leaders and there are a lot of different sorts of challenges. And there's an ascendant generation of leaders. I am a millennial smack dab in the middle of that generation. We're working with a lot of Gen Z folks in the workplace now. I know this is something you've written about a lot. And so where do these ascendant leaders go? How do they reinvent their institutions, their organizations? What does the future of work look like post-pandemic? These were questions that I thought needed, if not answers, then sort of discourse built around them. And that's what the newsletter has been. It is bi-weekly. I've sort of taken the last 5 weeks or so off. It's the summertime, and August is a time when I'm using to rest and refresh. But we'll be back in September with more regular content. And this also came out of my last role where I had my own media business. So I know the importance of conversations, whether they're oral or visual, and that's why I don't think that's why we do the newsletter, but it certainly was the reason it began. Now we do the newsletter because I get to learn a lot from brilliant leaders. I mean that's the fun I get to have now.
Yeah, I mean, content based networking, it's all value added, and the fact that you get to develop those But I think you made a point, and this will kind of transition us because I know that this is a topic that you're leading the show on this one. But you said that part of the reason you wanted it is that there's a lot of things that are happening with future of work and ascendant leaders, and a lot of changes happening in the workplace, and it's really easy. We see it where it's like sometimes people don't know how to create their second, third, or fourth act of life and stay within the times. And we're actually seeing it on a global scale when people aren't forward thinking and making decisions based on the past. It hurts everything. And you also said looking for answers, but then you said actually not looking for answers, but we need to start discourse, because I don't think there is a right or wrong answer. And I think too much nowadays, getting into the topic of innovation, when we think what is innovation, and we get into our topic, just like with leadership, we're always looking for the right fucking answer, but the right answer never exists, right?
Right,
And
right.
there's
Well,
too much
yeah,
school of thought. We need to have conversations. Conversations leads to innovation. Innovation then becomes out of ideas, right? Conversations lead to ideas. Ideas, innovation. And so if we don't start conversations and have really cool and deep conversations, what does innovation even mean, and where does it
right.
come
And I
from?
think, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in there, but I got excited about that because I think that, so yes, it's, we don't have answers. We want to create the conversation. We want to create the discourse, but also I think, again, what I loved in the dreams and details methodology, what I still love, what we practice is that innovation comes out of leadership, that the right way of thinking about how to lead a team, or and knowing that good leadership is good followership. Only from there can you start to, as you said, implement the ideas you have and realize a reinvention, realize an innovation, realize what we could call the dynamic change of season, right? It's a way that you can that you can actually prepare for and excel in a change of season, which means a market shift, which means a socio-cultural shift, which means, as we're discussing the future of work, that suddenly overnight everybody's working from home and not everyone's going back to the office, at least in the information economy, 2.5 years later. There's a lot to unpack in all of this. I mean, I think that the real trouble with some of these conversations, not ours, but maybe ours, is that you start in like buzzword land, and we're preaching to a certain section of an already converted audience. Again, as I mentioned, folks who work in the information economy, so largely white collar jobs, folks who are thinking about uh, like how to reinvent their firm because they're in a position of senior leadership, right? They're not necessarily early in their career, and folks who work in and around innovation because they want to be maybe in an exciting business unit, not necessarily because they know how hard it actually is. And I think that the big lessons I've learned this year, in terms of, and when I bring this methodology out to prospective clients, or when I talk about it with fellow ecosystem leaders like yourself, uh, the big thing I learned is that these lessons are applicable to, as we were mentioning a moment ago, anybody at any stage in their career. They're definitely, and this idea that leadership can lead to innovation is maybe not as popular as I had assumed it would be. Like, I do have to start at a slightly earlier stage. I think that when a lot of folks think about innovation in conversations I have, and this is anecdotal, they're thinking about ways of working with startups, exciting. Which is great, which I want to talk about, which I believe in. They're thinking about new tech products, and a lot of times they're thinking about, am I making money? Am I saving money? I don't know. They're thinking about it as a strategy tied to taking a brave position, taking a leadership position. I don't know how popular that idea is. I think leadership, when it's most dismissed, maybe is the right word, for the worst, and it's unfortunate. I think it's considered something that you can, like, it's like the realm of motivational speakers. What we really believe and have pushed forward into the business discourse is that leadership is the jumping off point for reinvention, for innovation, as we were saying. And that is so fundamental. And I had to sort of check my ego, check, you know, sort of reacquaint myself uh, with why I got into the business world in the first place, ask myself what I thought was truly important in my career, and yes, it is to be innovative, but I don't think that innovation is something that we can separate from being a leader, and from trusting the right leaders too.
I mean, that's to me that's really interesting because we think of. I think it's really interesting. Of you use interesting twice in a row, but this concept of innovation and leadership tying together, and how does that, how growth in leadership creates innovation. And I think that while that inherently seems to be linked, we don't actually discuss that much, because we think, oh, innovative ideas come from conversations, from new market, new products, new things. But at the core, it comes from being a good leader and having a team or a person at an organization willing to take a stand and do something bold and go in a direction that by nature, when you innovate, a lot of people will think you're crazy at first because you're kind of starting something new, or you're going for a really big thing that most other people don't see. And so that takes a really strong leader to go be able to execute on that through all the potential negative pushback, the obstacles, right?
Yeah.
We think there's a book called The Obstacle is the Way, leading into that discomfort, because on the other side of that is where you're really going to learn. And it's really easy for us to just say, well, let's stick to the tried and true methodology. And I don't think that works anymore. We can't just say, well, what worked in the past is going to work future, because
Well,
everything's
totally. And,
changed.
and the definition of insanity is, and I'm paraphrasing here, to do the same thing a million times and expect a different result, right? Expect a different outcome. So like, I do think that the ability to react to a dynamic change of season and to be able to reinvent yourself while market forces are moving, while the world is changing. I mean, we look at the last couple of years in world history, and beyond a pandemic, a contentious election here in the United States, a war in Ukraine, like business leaders have to respond to these issues. They have to respond to the issues in the market. They have to respond to the issues among what's going on with their employees. Um, and I think by and large, you're seeing like the best and bravest leaders respond well. Like I think but so it's interesting. People are at the center of the business conversation again, which I also like and respect. I will say, and maybe this is a good transition to a topic near and dear to my heart, which is open innovation, right? If we're saying that leadership inspires innovation, then what is open innovation? Open innovation, more broadly, because I had a role where open innovation was actually in my job title once upon a time. But the open innovation, very broadly, is looking outside of these silos within your institution for inspiration, for help, and for new business development, right? So it's large corporates or government offices looking to early stage companies, early stage firms for support, whether you want to be their customer, whether you want to invest in them, whether you want to collaborate, whether you want to form a joint venture, and so on. So it's really breaking out of your box to seek help elsewhere, to look into what we all call an ecosystem for support, for innovation help, essentially. And what's interesting about that is on either side of that table, whether you're a corporate innovator or you're a founder, I really don't know how, in my experience, right? I don't know how important leadership was in my own training. Like when you're a founder, you're like, I got to get this product out and I got to raise money. Right? Those are and because we live in a culture where we reward wealth and status and all those other things for like the more money you raise, the more users you have and so on. That's what's impressive. Not necessarily does your team love you, or does your board love you, or and I don't say love, you know what I mean, but like are you setting the tone is not actually necessarily encouraged. And startup CEO school on day one. I'm not saying it's discouraged, but it's just not something that is as paramount in the training of an early stage CEO. And the open innovator side, right? The corporate innovator, the one practicing, trying to open up the innovation and looking out at the startups, more frequently than not in a cynical organization, what I've seen, they're trying to keep their job. They're trying to manage up. They're deeply afraid of taking a risk. They don't know why they're incentivized to take that risk. And so invariably they do not. And so you end up having a lot of what I call, and what I'm working on a project about, innovation theater, where it's sort of performative innovation, which is ridiculous because ultimately you have an open innovation team that wants to work with a startup and cares. You have a startup team that needs the revenue that working with a corporate would bring you. And so to me, all of my startup years and my corporate years, like they keep coming in and around this, they keep meeting in this problem. And I see leadership as a solution. The right methodology, the right language, right? The right language to be shared between the corporate leader and the startup leader. That's really important. And I see that as a jumping off point for actually trying to solve the open innovation problem. And it wasn't until I met the folks at IDENIA and it wasn't until I read Dreams and Details that I was even aware that a leadership methodology had been what I'd been missing. So, I just wanted to connect those dots, which is like, yes, if leadership kicks off innovation, then open innovation, a very difficult kind of innovation, like literally can't work without leadership.
I mean, a good friend of ours, Greg Larkin, talks about entrepreneurship and what it means to be an entrepreneur and innovator in that
Yeah.
regard of, um, a lot of times is you gotta lean into the discomfort because you're working for a risk averse company. You have to handle the detractors and really get them on your side. You have to be really good at pushing those boundaries. And he has his group Punks and Pinstripes, right? The idea that you have to be a punk inside a very button up organization to get change to happen. And we did a great episode on that. So for all those listening to the Bare Necessities or Leadership 2030, I'll link that episode in the show notes. You can take a look at it.
Yeah, and Greg Larkin was a guest on 2030 Leadership too.
Perfect. So
he's
we
a no,
got
we,
two
we love
links
him.
to go check out.
He's a yeah. One day the three of us will just do our podcast, but we
we have to book out like 4 hours for that, right? For the three of us sitting together in a room.
Day. But I want to say something about Greg because beyond that, Greg is brilliant. And hi, Greg, if you're watching or listening. But here's what I think about entrepreneurship. Not like what I think. It's not I'm not gonna like do a mic drop. First of all, I can't because the mic is right here. I'm not holding it. But I think the revelation I had about entrepreneurship is it does take a lot of different. It takes a lot of different kinds of folks, and also there's lots of ways of being a successful entrepreneur. And Greg's, by the way, been a successful entrepreneur, coaches successful entrepreneur. The open innovation thing is different. It's like, how can an executive work with an entrepreneur? No one's really trying necessarily to be an entrepreneur. They're trying to be really good at their job and succeed at their job by working with an entrepreneur. It's a collaborative experience. And so, do I think that entrepreneurship is good leadership? The best entrepreneurs are also the best leaders? Sure. The way I think that any executive requires leadership. But again, to go back to the specificity of open innovation, it's a different kind of executive and it's a different kind of relationship. And Greg also, I think, because he's kind of a provocateur, and I love that about him, will ask, well, you name the best startup corporate collaborations, Matt. When we'll get together and he'll be like, well, can you name a company that's bottom line was substantially changed by an open innovation collaboration with a startup or scale up? And I can and I have, but not necessarily in the way he's describing. I think that there's some truth to that open. But here's my counter argument: in our new world, a post-COVID world, a world as digitized as ever, where the information and industrial economy meet, like you cannot depend on good ideas coming from the inside exclusively. That you can't. So you might have been able to get away with that for a while, but that's no longer the case. So I don't think the same way that we often joke, like, you don't call a company an internet company, it's just a company. I don't think we'll be talking about open innovation as a business unit in the next 15 years. I think it'll just be like a unit where the new ideas happen. I don't know what you call it, I don't know what happens, but it's a place where in most successful firms that's where the startups go to work with executives. That's the safe place for the new ideas.
I hope that you're right in that because from my view, and this is not negative to, I have a lot of friends that work at larger organizations in the innovation departments. And as I learn more, I see it, but it's really hard to see because from my perspective, I look at people who have innovation in their title at these big corporates. They barely had a cup of coffee ever working in a startup. And a lot of times they just want to get in this partnership mode of like looking and evaluating talent, but they've never been there, done that. And like, I think what's different that you bring to the table is you were always trying to tie those loops because you went through the struggle of being a broke entrepreneur and building stuff. And I think
that's a really totally, there's nothing like not having any money to make you want to help founders when you recognize yourself in them, right? Like that is a, as a friend of mine would say, full stop. Like that is exactly it. And that's really scary. And I think a lot of executives either forget that or don't recognize the import of that POC that pilot, that, whatever the scope of the deal they want to do, like when that budget is either delayed or it gets tied up in procurement, or it doesn't, or like, I don't know, or it gets messed around because another senior leader walked in and decided at the last minute that it didn't belong there. Like, accounting in a corporation, when you're otherwise going to be spending that money on a startup collaboration, could really hurt that startup, I think.
Well, the reason I bring this point up of why it kind of bothers me, and why I think this needs to happen, and I love the trend of where this is going, what you're saying is that if we actually look at the big corporates out there today and we look at leadership, none of the leadership that is currently in place was there when the company started. So they've grown into a role, into a company that already had money, already had process, already had stability, and so they're able to chug along and do their job. Now they're able to innovate within that, do really cool things, launch new products, all these things. But to that point, many leaders in larger organizations have never been in the place of, this is the last $10,000 in my bank account. If we don't do what we need to do in the next 60 days, I can't pay the 5 employees that I have, and I have to lay everybody off.
I
Right?
can't pay the 5 employees. I can't pay rent at this co-working space that we're
Any
in
of
that
it.
you think is so cool, but is actually kind of, you know, like it's where I actually work. It's not my sort of performance space. I think that I when I first heard the phrase innovation theater, it was from a founder at a co-working space that I was helping to manage, and we said a bunch of executives are going to come and visit at some point, and he did great work with the firm, and we had a particularly innovative firm. I mean, my experience in a corporation was a lot of folks were hungry to actually innovate, which is unique, and something I'm very proud of all these years later. But especially when I saw other, when I got to see more of the lay of the land and meet a lot of other corporate innovation folks, the because you don't know what you don't know. Like, I was in a smaller world where a lot of people I knew were smart and driven and really interested, and you realize how lucky sometimes you are to be on a certain team at a certain time. And the experience I had with this founder was, and I said a bunch of executives are going to come and take a look at and want to meet you. He was like, oh, like sort of a innovation petting zoo, innovation theater, like, are they going to come and stare at us through our, like, we go to work. Like, how weird would it be if I went up to their office and walked into their cubicles that were, yes, maybe not lit as well, not as exciting, and didn't have access to, a keg or coffee or foosball tables and whatever, but is ultimately still a workplace. And, I'm really interested in how this is going to change again during the sort of COVID and post-COVID era, where on the one hand, it's great that you can see anybody anytime you want on Zoom or Teams or whatever. On the other hand, part of that excitement that I saw in executives was the chance to break out of their environment, was the chance to, like, again, to use Dreams and Details language, was to jump into the change of season, was to embrace the change of season, to smell the leaves falling and race toward it. That was exciting. And that came from a change of location and being in a startup environment. And if fewer and fewer people are going into workplaces of any kind, will that same cultural translation take place? Will people still feel as inspired by their surroundings? I truly don't know.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting because we saw, if you've seen We Crashed, right? Whenever Adam had
I
a
didn't,
big
but I lived
executive
it.
come in, he had everybody set up and had people talking and people laughing, and there was a little bit of theatrics to the vibe that he wanted people to see from the walk off the elevator into his office.
Yeah,
And I experienced that early in my career back in 2012 when Nationwide became a full agile shop. They did all open seating, pods. They had all the stand ups, the sticky notes, all the colors, and tons of people would come to Des Moines to go check out that because it was the first of its kind. 3 floors were built out that way.
of
And I
course.
brought my executives to show them that as well because Nationwide was my large client. And I just remembered, them talking about that. And I never even thought about like innovation theater. I love this topic because it's like, holy shit. Like, I remember everyone was trying to do their job, but also put on a little bit of face because they had people walking around and you wanted
Yeah,
to feel good.
it's a performance. And so WeWork is interesting. So I was the first entrepreneur in residence at WeWork Labs, and this was after my time as a corporate innovator. But WeWork's a complicated story for so many reasons. I actually didn't watch We Crashed. I probably should. Uh, but there's a WeWork's complicated because it created a world that people wanted to be. like Disney or something. You know what I mean? Like there was like a sense that you could walk in and experience it. And my manager for the time at when I was at when I had an open innovation role, because we built a co-working space as part of our mandate, um, came from real estate at one time in his career, and similarly like knew how to sell space. And I came from a world of, I mean, like I couldn't be less into space. Like I don't even know how to explain it. Like I was like working at a coffee shops. All I needed was my laptop. This is a waste of money. What are we doing? And then maybe like 5 days into the role, I realized how important it was that this space was there. And by the way, the space to this day exists on 23rd Street in Manhattan. And it's a meaningful thing in people's lives, meaningful in mine. I still work out of there frequently when I'm down in New York. And so there's a anyway, the point of the story, I guess, with WeWork was WeWork created a template for all manner of institutions. Like I'm sure that some of the folks at Nationwide got a whiff of this co-working phenomenon elsewhere in the country, happening in San Francisco and New York and other places. I remember when in London there was a big surge of interest because all of a sudden co-working was taking off. Adam Newman, the founder and CEO of WeWork, had another co-working company in Brooklyn that I looked at for my first office for my first business before WeWork existed. And then my WeWork office, before I worked with WeWork, my first WeWork office was the first WeWork office at all at 154 Grand and Lafayette. So, I mean, like I remember all of that and lived through it. And it was interesting to see how that component, the sort of vaguely grungy, stay caffeinated, do what you love branding that WeWork created, became the easiest thing for larger institutions to see. So building accelerators can be very difficult. Building incubators is by design a long-term incubation process. Meeting with startups and taking the time to work out personal relationships is difficult. You know what that all requires? Leadership. You know what doesn't? Copying an exciting brand. So why did a lot of these big institutions not reinvent themselves, not opt for leadership? I think because they got really excited by the innovation theater. That's a thesis I've been developing with research and work on this book that I mentioned, but also it's something that I couldn't put into words while I was living it. Like I'm 34, so I am, as I said, like a perfect millennial age, born in 88. And the experience of being 22, 23, 24 at that time, particularly in New York, was like you became like a millennial whisperer. You would like explain to senior executives what was happening. They'd be like, why are people wearing hoodies to work? And what's going on here? And whatever. And it was like I spent half my time explaining that people were actually working really hard on stuff. It's just what they were working hard on didn't require receptionists or some hardware beyond your laptop or cubicles where you had to do secret calls. You know, everything was just a little more open. But you know, culture change in the way you work does not necessarily yield innovation either. And I think that's the other lesson of the last 10 years was what happened, what changed. I happen to love WeWork. I love the spaces, the people that I met there. A lot of them, my friends who are former executives, etc., genuinely phenomenal people. And I think that the vision for WeWork was transformative. But was it like corporate innovation? Did like a corporate change by working out of WeWork? I hope so. But I think the jury's still out. I don't have an opinion on that. And more than not having an opinion, more importantly, I don't have proof. I don't have data one way or another. But so I think the skeptics are like, that was all a mess. What the hell was that about? And that's not fair. But I think the folks that are maybe too positive, right? Like put some cool graffiti looking lettering on your office, get a bunch of young people in beanbags into a room and suddenly the corporate changes. I think that's naive too. I think it takes this hard work and it takes a broken record, but you know, I have an agenda. I do genuinely, I believe in it. It takes leadership. All of this requires leadership.
So I love that you kind of bring that up because we wrap innovation as a thing with like branding, and why companies it's easier to kind of rebrand and slap a new logo or some new colors or you know different times of years like update their logo for like the month of whatever we're kind of wanting to highlight, and that all looks like forward thinking and innovative, but it's not. It's just doing things that we wrap innovation on that actually don't change much,
Right.
if at all. Even to your point of like, you don't have the data on it because we don't tangibly see it the same way. And which is why I'm really excited, because part two of this conversation is going to be how do startups and corporates really learn to work together. Now that we understand what kind of innovation and leadership looks like, part two of the conversation is going to be how do they work together. But I think it's really important for everyone out there to understand what leadership means, not just from an executive level, but from your individual level, and how you bring that into what you do and how you try to do that to make a positive change in the environment that you're in. And that's what I love about this concept of open innovation. That's why I was really excited to chat about this and really start to, because for me, I had a jaded view. Open innovation and corporate innovation was bullshit, right? Because I've only been on the startup side. I've worked in corporates before, but in different capacities, mostly recruitment, which is not going to innovate anything.
No, totally. And by the way, it's like you and I are also of I think the generational thing here is big. And again, as we wrap up this conversation before going to part two, I think there's something I want to say about this. Like I was reading recently this study that a lot of folks in Generation Z coming out of school in the pandemic, university in the pandemic, I should clarify, are looking for roles at large corporations. I saw that Microsoft was, and we'll put in the show notes maybe the article I was reading, that the that Microsoft was the most popular choice of employer, and they were looking at other cities, more affordable cities than sort of the largest metropolitan areas you think about. So Scottsdale, Arizona, at least in the U.S., was the most popular choice of city. Now, when I was coming out of school, it's like you wanted to work at a startup and live in Brooklyn, and so it's really interesting, right? Just how different that was, and I think it's because again, I don't have the data, this is anecdotal, but I think it's because our crisis coming out of school was jobs. The crisis now is quite different. It's a combination of inflation, supply chain, and I think general extreme discord, like real discord. Like we are in a societally complicated place vis-a-vis climate change, vis-a-vis, as I said, the war in Ukraine, vis-a-vis the pandemic. But when we were coming out of school was a recession, and what that genuinely meant first in the wake of the housing crisis was a lack of immediate jobs for young people, which has had a long tail effect of really complicated things. Right, we've seen it with low home ownership for our generation, the first generation in modern American history that will make less than their parents, and so on. And I think that the excitement that came in big cities that might seem to 22-year-olds now sort of cringy was based on the sense that you could make your own job. And so the hustle culture, the like disrupt or be disrupted culture, which has had negative impacts, genuinely, but that drew the attention of the corporates in the first place, that made the Microsofts want to innovate rather than just be a place for stable employment, and maybe down the line a place for so-called quiet quitting, which
Yeah, I
another
was to
trend
say
that's
that whole
happening.
new trend now is quiet
The
quitting, where
whole
you
new
can
trend, yep.
hold a job but
But I think
actually
that
not do anything.
the millennial aspect of it, just to tie a little bow on that thought, is one that was completely unique and circumstantial to an economic moment and worth understanding as such, that like I can look back and see the cringier parts of WeWork, the real ramifications of disrupt or be disrupted, and so on, and I can see what parts were innovation theater and what weren't. But I can also see a moment when, again, younger kids, they grew up with this stuff. I was 19 when the smartphone came out, so like this was new, and there was a new reaction that had never happened before, and the sense of fear that had come from both a generational wipeout of employment opportunities and at the same exact time rapid technological advancement, right? That in a handful of years you had ubiquitous Wi-Fi, mobile phones with ubiquitous Wi-Fi, and tablets that all happened in about a 3 or 4 year period. And then the rise of social networks like Facebook and Twitter made possible by those technological advancements. So you were suddenly constantly online and constantly accessing information online at the same time. That was a reaction. The sort of innovation theater was a reaction to that. And now it's up to these corporates, having seen what was performative over the last 10 years, to do something real. And to do something real requires, yes, open innovation, which I think we're saying, but it requires something that comes first in the chronology and something that gives the open innovation process liftoff, which is serious leadership. I think that's a good place to actually drop the mic and tell everyone to come back for part two.
Yeah, I mean, I love that point, and I 100% agree with you in this whole Gen Z thing. And I was surprised too when I saw that data, but we learned what, part of the whole millennial movement was because we also didn't want to be stuck in the same job for 20 years, working up a ladder and all those things. And, now Gen Z looks at like, I don't want to be hustling, scraping, living paycheck to paycheck when I can go work for a big corporate in a better cost of living city and travel. I do think also the one thing you didn't touch on that's a big piece is the influencer culture, this content creator society, that if you have more money and a better cost of living, you can go do the things in other cities versus if you're
Right.
struggling,
That
you
as an
don't have a
influencer,
chance
you
to
can
show
make
off.
money. Yeah, I do push back on one thing though, which is that you don't want a life where you work your way up the ladder. I don't. I mean, you and I lived it. Like that wasn't really an opportunity. I do want to be clear about that. That I mean, now you actually have an opportunity to find stable employment in a way that was not available to graduates 12 years ago, or 14 years ago, or 10 years ago. But that period from like '07 to 2012, that wasn't. It was different, and so previous generations have been like, I don't want to work at the same insurance company because I want freedom, I want creativity. I get that, but I think having professionally come of age at a time when you couldn't get a job at an insurance company, I just think again it's a little bit different.
Yeah. Well, what I mean by that though is like you can be in one field, i.e., you can have a startup, and then because of your experience in a startup, you can actually go get a job at an amazing organization, bank, and open
Right.
innovation. You wouldn't be able to make that transition if you didn't work up the corporate ladder. You're not the only lateral move or up move you're making is in the same industry. You couldn't jump industries and say, I have a great experience and I've done some amazing things as an entrepreneur in tech. Let me see how I can bring that to the financial world and help with fintech or into the insurance world. And you didn't have that opportunity to maybe make those movements sideways or into new industries the same way that we had. We created that in the millennial generation. So just to
That's a really
clarify
good
that point.
point. That exactly that whole. It's funny you say that. So we started this conversation again, always in the middle of the conversation, ironically, which is how a lot of these things go. But for folks who are listening or watching, this is familiar to them. These buzzwords, and if they're not, reach out. Happy to discuss it. But what's interesting, you just said that like we made that possible. That's true. That like we're talking about open innovation, which Henry Chesbrough sort of proffered that as a theory back in 2003. It became a practice, right? It was an actual like in my world, for example, it's been my job, either specifically or generally for 7 years. Or so you're right, that was made possible. Even the idea that Davids and Goliaths, insurgents and incumbents, corporate startups can work together at all in the first place. You're right, that was made possible in that last run in the last 10 years. And maybe that's again getting part two of this geared up. I do think that what's been missing, just to full circle this, we have all the pieces in play, but what allows open innovation to succeed and keep it from being open innovation theater is leadership.
Yeah, 100%. That's a great way to end. So that's part one. So part one was talking really about leadership and open innovation. Part two is going to be all about how do corporates and startups work together, and something that Matt and I can talk for hours on. So we'll try to keep it short and sweet, but I'm excited for y'all to tune into that one. Matt, as always, this has been a lot of fun. For those of Bear Nation, thank you so much. For those of 2030 Leadership, thank you so much. Bear Nation listeners, go subscribe to 2030 Leadership newsletter. It will be worth your while. 2030 newsletter subscribers, check out the Bare Necessities podcast, as there's a lot of great. It will also be
worth your while. Yeah, and I will say that like only in this kind of conversation, everybody, can you learn about open innovation more broadly, right? And like we've been using that, and now it's next time it's going to be specific within the realm of open innovation. This idea that corporate and startups collaborate, how is that done practically? That's the cliffhanger we'll leave for you. And I'm not going to say you're not going to learn if you don't subscribe, but you might not. You might never know the answers to those things. You might just be curious for the rest of your life.
Absolutely. Well, Matt, once again, thank you. And to everyone out there, stay well and rise up. Bear Nation, thanks for listening to the Bare Necessities of Entrepreneurship. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a review.